So we're gonna follow similar pattern. So we're gonna follow similar pattern to what we've been doing. We'll talk about some adaptations. We'll talk about a bunch of the same categories as well for reptiles as we did with some of the other groups, and sort of compare them, talk about interesting adaptations, examples, and we'll move on from there. So reptiles include a variety of organisms. Some people do confuse some of the reptiles with some of the amphibians, but they are distinct in several ways. And so examples of reptiles include things like snakes, lizards, crocodiles, alligators, turtles. These are all reptiles. And so some of you mentioned their body covering. So reptiles have a body that's covered in scales. And scales are an adaptation that reptiles developed. So if we're thinking about evolution again, and we start with the first vertebrates, which were what? Fish, which evolved, a subgroup of fish evolved into amphibians, who were able to spend a significant part of their life on land. But amphibians always required the water for at least some portion of their life. Why did they require the water? When during their life? Guys? Yeah, for reproduction. Amphibians need to always return to the water for reproduction because their eggs are laid externally and fertilized externally and develop externally. They basically needed to be in the water so they didn't dry up. So reptiles evolved from a group of amphibians, and they have several adaptations that allowed them to do what? Live their entire life on land. And so a body covered in scales is one of those adaptations. Scales provide a waterproof covering. If you remember, amphibians had a thin skin. They could absorb water through, they could absorb oxygen, but they could also dehydrate relatively easily. Reptiles, on the other hand, they have a waterproof coating so that they don't dry out very easily. How about their body temperature? Raise your hand. Somebody, I guess somebody already mentioned this. Abby?
Cold-blooded.
They're cold-blooded, like amphibians, like fish. The technical term for cold-blooded is ectothermic, really. That's really a better term. They rely on the outside ectothermic for their body heat. So remind me, though, of the advantage of cold-blooded. John?
It just refers which energy.
Doesn't require as much energy. Remind me about a disadvantage of animals being cold-blooded. Tyler? Yeah, they can't be very active under low temperatures. Can't live in as wide a variety of habitats in terms of climate. So one feature that evolved in reptiles is, so they needed, in order to live permanently on land, need some way of allowing for fertilization outside of the water. So in fish and amphibians, the males release sperm cells into the water, they can swim through the water, they can fertilize the eggs. Well, in reptiles, it's not possible. Eggs would dry up instantly outside of the reptile's body. Sperm would have no medium to travel through to fertilize those eggs. So they evolved internal fertilization. So in internal fertilization, the male deposits sperm into the female reproductive reproductive tract, into the female body. The sperm cells make their way to the egg cells inside of the female body. And they then fertilize the eggs. And so that's internal fertilization. It doesn't require a pond or a stream or an ocean for fertilization to take place. Now what happens after that in reptiles, once the sperm have fertilized the egg, then the egg forms with a leathery shell around it. So this waterproof leathery shell is really important because what it really does is it provides a tiny little enclosed watery environment for what to happen. What happens inside of that egg? And that's where the embryo grows until it's developed enough to hatch. So in fish and amphibians, that all happened in the water. The embryo is growing in the water, eventually hatches out of their jelly-like egg, and goes and lives on its own. In reptiles, those leathery eggs provide sort of that watery environment, but it's all enclosed in a shell. Has anyone ever felt
One egg?
a reptile egg?
Yes.
You see them sometimes. The most common place I see them is like if you're hiking near like ponds and streams. Sometimes you find turtle eggs in the spring that have hatched, but the eggs are still there. If you pick them up, they're kind of flexible and soft. It's not like a bird egg that you would imagine with a hard sort of brittle shell. It's sort of a soft, pliable shell. So it's a little bit different in terms of its structure from a bird egg. So yeah, that provides a small little watery environment where the young can develop. They're laid on land. Often they're buried or put into a nest, or sometimes protected by one of the parents, usually the female. So generally, what do you think about the number of eggs produced by reptiles versus amphibians? Yeah, it is lower. It takes a lot more energy to produce these large eggs with this watery shell. You need to have room for the young to grow. So that takes a lot more energy than little tiny jelly-like fish or amphibian eggs. And so they can't produce hundreds and hundreds of eggs at one time, or thousands. Instead they produce, a few eggs or a dozen eggs, or somewhere fewer than in amphibians. So in those eggs, the young is developing. Different species have different times in which the young need to grow and develop, but they're developing externally, outside of the female's body. How many chambers were in a fish's heart? I'm hearing both. It doesn't really vary. 2.5 in fish. Amphibians? 3. Reptiles? 3-ish.
How do you have? Is there like 3.5?
So they have sort of a strange arrangement typically in the heart of amphibians. So they have what we call a 3.5 chambered heart. Well, how do you have half a chamber? Well, this is a diagram. So what are these chambers where blood enters called? Atria, yep. So blood enters, there's 2 chambers. What's the pumping chamber?
The big one.
Ventricle. But in the reptiles, there's actually a wall that partially divides the ventricle into 2 chambers. Now, it doesn't quite fully divide it. If this wall extended all the way here, that would be a 4-chambered heart, because these 2 ventricles will be split in 2. But it's not quite. So that's why we say a 3.5 chambered heart. And that 3.5 chambered heart is a little bit more efficient at getting blood oxygenated and delivered to the cells than a 3 or a 2-chambered heart. Also, in reptiles, many reptiles go through a process of molting. You know what that is?
Shedding skin.
We did?
Yes.
Oh, we talked about it with insects, yes. So yeah, shedding of their skin. So those scales, as they grow, the outer layer sort of dies, and sometimes, you might see this with snakes a lot of times, shedding their, this dry external layer of scales, and they have new scales
It also
underneath.
is really thin too.
Yeah, it's very thin.
But you can still see the shape of the snake.
All right, I'm going to show you a couple of videos here.
Your kids? I'll eat your kids.
All right, so
What?